Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Sara Guzman, and I'm the museum archivist at Himdag Ki Cultural Center and Museum in Topawa. Um, so, the presentation tonight is a revision of a presentation that I gave last year of the history of the Tohono, or formerly known as the Papago Rodeo and Fair. Um, This has been a progressive type of project, constantly adding more and more to the history because it is expansive. It's over 300 years of rodeo history. Trying to cram it all into 1 hour can be challenging. I would ask that for now we reserve all of our questions and comments till after the presentation, and then we can have more of a discussion and do Q&A. All right, so we're going to begin a few hundred years back. Briefly, I just wanted to touch on some points in history that pretty much led up to um, the establishment of cowboy culture and ranching culture on Tohono Nation, as well as touch on a few of the aspects of how Tohono Nation formulated as a government, with cells as its political and communal epicenter. So I think it's important to recognize first that the establishment of the Spanish Jesuit missions on what they called the Pimeria Alta in the late 1680s, 1690s was key in setting up the foundation for agriculture and livestock raising. And it established many Otham men as ranchers. When the Jesuits brought over all the horses and cattle and other livestock, Otham men were left to tend to and take care of all of this, all of the livestock and the land that was there. This new lifestyle of ranching also brought other changes to Otham people, such as clothing styles and the introduction of new crops that the Spaniards brought over. So, despite the many controversies surrounding the Jesuit occupation of Otham land, the Jesuits did provide protections over the land in some way so that it wasn't largely settled upon and encroached upon by other non-native peoples. So the church had enough authority to set those legal parameters to protect land from further settlement. And after the Jesuit expulsion, the Franciscan order took religious control over this area, and they continued to provide those same protections that the Jesuits did, protecting it against further encroachment. And they did recognize the inherent right of the Otham people to their land. So I think that was beneficial for the Otham, that the Jesuits and the Franciscans did protect their land in that way. However, when the Franciscans left what they called the Pimeria Alta or Papagera in 1828, the land then became pretty much public domain, and it was open to settlers, as the lands were no longer legally protected, and there were no legal protections um, that really established those land boundaries. So, starting as early as 1839, Spanish and Mexican gold miners started moving into the area. They rushed into this area not only for gold, but silver and copper and other valuable minerals. And in the 1850s, that's when more of the Anglo settlers became, settling into the area because of its agricultural potential. The land had always had these really natural and deep water wells, and so this provided irrigation for ranches and things like that. So at this point, after 1828, settlement became a really big concern for O'odham people as more and more foreigners encroached on their ancestral lands. The O'odham people actually made several official complaints to the Office of Indian Affairs in Washington, and they demanded legal protections over their land. The U.S. Secretary of War John C. Calhoun established the Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1824. From 1824 to about 1819, the land that is now Tohono O'odham Nation was under the jurisdiction of the Pima Indian Agency at Sackatoon, Arizona. So the Pima Agency instated a representative there named John M. Berger, and he received several documented complaints from O'odham, not only in current day where the districts are now, but also in the Phoenix area. There were complaints of settlers encroaching upon indigenous land. And he also received many complaints from San Javier. However, unfortunately, he wasn't really equipped to deal with these type of issues. After all, John M. Berger himself was an Anglo settler, and he was a ranchman. And so when the O'odham demanded these lands protection, they pretty much met a brick wall because he had already, I would say he was probably biased at that point. And none of their complaints ever really had any, it never really went anywhere, unfortunately. That is until Berger was transferred at the San Javier Reservation in 1892, and he stayed there until 1910 when Henry J. McQuigg took over as superintendent of the San Javier Agency. And Mr. Quigg then took on those complaints that were being filed by O'odham people demanding land protections. So finally, we come to President Woodrow Wilson taking office March 4th of 1913. And between his first and second term on January 14th, 1916, he signed an executive order designating 2,800,000 acres of land for what they called the Papago people back then, creating the Papago Reservation. In 1919, the BIA agency was moved off of San Javier and relocated at Sells. So that same year, in 1919, the area was formally named Sells in honor of the then Commissioner of Indian Sells, Cato Sells. From then on, Sells became the epicenter for O'odham people, not only as its capital, but as a hub for community events and centralized services such as the post office, a hospital, schools, and of course the BIA office. So there's a few terms that are interchangeable. Like when I say cells, it's also, what I mean is, because this area has been called by so many names throughout history, its first name, however, obviously is the name its indigenous people gave to it. O'odham oral tradition says that the oldest name for that area that we know as cells is Kamakare wa Osidik, hope I pronounced that right, which means turtle wedged in autumn. And in 1919, US President William Taft designated funding and land for the building of missionary schools and water wells around Turtle Wedged, which gave it the name Indian Wells. Indian Oasis was another unofficial name of this area, and that was taken from the Indian Oasis mercantile store that was owned by Joseph and Louis Miniger, who were successful Anglo businessmen and cattle ranchers that owned property near the border going towards Kitovac. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with Miniger's Dam and Miniger's Lake. That's about around where their property was, and that's where the name was taken from, was those two brothers. The Minigers also employed several Otham ranch hands on their ranch. So you can begin to recognize that the Otham had a very long history being cattlemen, being ranchmen, long before the establishment of the official Papago Tohono Otham Nation rodeo and fair. So in the early 1900s, Otham ranchers, mainly men, would herd their cattle to sales around the area where the intermediate school is currently located. The men held cattle drives there to market in Tucson, and it was during this time that the men from different ranches around the reservation began to pass their time engaging in competitions and games. You know, just a bunch of men horsing around. Mainly they did it for entertainment, but also to challenge each other. So it was during this early 1900s period that all the men started engaging in these early versions of rodeo sports. Around this same time, in the early 1900s, BIA agents would visit with the Otham and try to promote programs and activities that would further integrate them in American society. Such activities included encouraging Otham women to partake in contests such as the cutest baby competition. And this picture that you see here is a perfect example of very early rodeo and fair type activities for women. And I believe the baby show, which the winner would be the cutest baby, was part of the rodeo events all the way up until the late 40s, early 50s. And of course, there was the Tucson Rodeo, um, also called La Fiesta de los Vaqueros. It started in 1925, and Otham people, men and women, were among the first participants of this Tucson Rodeo. Many men and women partook in the competitions. Women mainly for marketing goods such as baskets and pottery. And the Tohono O'odham were so heavily involved in the Tucson Rodeo that promoters dedicated an entire day to O'odham-related rodeo and fair activities. And they called it Papago Day. So in 1950, the Tucson Chamber of Commerce set aside that day, February 25th, as Papago Day. And this was in honor of the O'odham's long-standing participation and contribution to the event. I also wanted to note that O'odham men competed in rodeos all over Arizona. prior to the establishment of their own tribal rodeo. So they participated in rodeos in Casa Grande and Phoenix and Benson, and really everywhere that there was a rodeo, you can bet that they were there participating. 1934 brought an end to the assimilation era as we know it, with the signing of the Indian Reorganization Act, also known as the Wheeler-Howard Act. And this policy aimed at decreasing federal control over American Indian affairs, thus allowing tribal nations or tribal people to become more autonomous. The Othan people accepted the New Deal and soon after exercised their new autonomy by establishing their 11 districts. That is Babakiri, Shukukuk, Guachi, Gubo, Hekiwan, Bisinmo, San Lucy, San Javier, Shukdoak, Sels, and Sefoidak. All of these districts were created from already existing ranching and grazing boundaries, and these ranching and grazing boundaries were an evolution of so many years of that cattle being on the land from the Jesuits and the Franciscans. And two members from each of those districts were selected as members of the first tribal council on July 10, 1936. In that same year, Jose Ignacio from Sales District was elected as the first tribal chairman. And later that year, on December 12, 1936, the Papago Constitution was ratified by the council and the tribe. On January 6, 1937, the Constitution and bylaws of the Papago tribe was approved by the Secretary of Interior. So I think it's important to note that written in Title II, Chapter 2 of the Constitution, the Rodeo and Fair Association was established at the very inception of the tribe creating itself as a government, because tribal leaders recognized early on that establishing the rodeo and fair for the nation would serve as an economic driver for their communities and a source of funding for the tribal council itself. In 1938, a resolution appointing members of the board of directors for the Papago Fair and Rodeo Association was enacted. The first board members included Richard Hendricks, the first chairman of the board, Frank Pablo, Peter Blaine, Pete Siqueiros, and the tribal chairman himself, Jose Ignacio. All members of the board were ranchmen. And I forgot to mention that all members of the first tribal council were also ranchmen. They were all cattlemen. So the first Papago Rodeo and Fair took place in October 1938. Jose Ignacio signed a Resolution 46 on October 1st, making the last weekend of October the official date of the event. The following year, construction on tribal council chambers began and was completed in 1940. So early on, we see evidence that the Rodeo Fair was often postponed and held in November, as seen on this program from 1941. Actually, although it was signed into resolution October, most of the rodeo events did occur in November, all the way up to the 1980s. You can see from old newspapers that the rodeo and fair took place in November rather than October. So it wasn't until very recently, it must have been probably either the late 90s or early 2000s, that the rodeo and fair switched to February. The most common reasons for postponement back in the 1940s and early 50s were mainly due to issues pertaining to cattle availability, which were exacerbated by drought and disease. And sometimes the rodeo and fair board simply just needed some extra time to plan. This image here is a front page of a program from 1941, and the building illustrated in front of it was the newly built council chambers. Here we can see a layout of the original rodeo and fairgrounds. Now this is cells. Just to give some perspective, here where my arrow is pointing, that's Topawa Road, and that goes off towards Topawa, towards the museum. And this is the main road, the business loop that cuts through cells. The rodeo arena used to be where the White House is, all those buildings near the White House. There's Dewitt and the legislative building, and all of that was the rodeo and fairgrounds. So obviously none of that was there. And this building here, right in front of the arena grandstand, was the tribal council chambers. And the carnival and the fair with the rides, all of that used to be in this area here, where the veterans memorials are. The hospital used to be next to where the human resources building is. And of course, across the street was where Indian Oasis Elementary School. That was all open space back then, but there was a school, but just further back. So the rodeo and fair was set up in this area until I believe in the 50s, the tribal building and the arena caught fire, and then in the 60s they planned to build the livestock complex that's further down, further west down 86. They had received a grant so I had found an article dating October 1976 that tribal cattlemen applied for an EDA, so that's Economic Development Administration grant in 1969 to finance a new livestock complex. And they were awarded $861,000 to construct the livestock complex. They were awarded that money in 1973, and then in 1975, the construction was completed at the livestock complex. And then the following year, 1976, had been the first year that the new rodeo events took place at the livestock complex. So this is a larger picture of the tribal council chambers, and it served the same purpose that the White House does today. The council chambers was also the main community building for the community. This building played a major role in the rodeo and fair festivities, hosting many of the fair activities, such as the Papago dance. There was film screenings there, concerts. There were student exhibition shows, and also arts and crafts shows. So that whole building was very important. I guess I should probably note that when the tribal council chambers caught fire in the 1950s, they moved all of these activities to the there was the school. They had a Cordell Hall, the elementary school's Cordell Hall, so that became the new location of all of these different events once the council chambers caught fire. Here's an image of the fair activities. And then there's a schedule of events in the same program from 1941. Um, as you can see, most of the rodeo activities listed here are still part of the festivities that go on today in today's rodeo. In fact, I think the only events that are no longer part of the rodeo that I know of for sure would be, it says the wood chopping race listed here, um, the baby show, and then football games. So apparently there were football games that were originally part of the festivities, but that's no longer there. However, a lot of the actual rodeo events and sports that involve livestock and cattle and horses are all still people still compete in those today. So um, that includes calf roping and bareback riding, steer riding, bulldogging, team tying, bronco riding. All of those are still very much a part of the rodeo. So rodeo sporting competitions in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. I just want to clarify that those were just for men. The women's competitions in the 30s through the 60s mainly consisted of the Toka game, the Oya race, competitions such as, the baby show, arts and crafts related competitions such as best in show for basketry, for example. There was also a best dress competition for both men and women from the 1930s to the 1950s. And there are several more sporting games nowadays in which women can partake today. Third image, this is an older image of bronco riding and a newer one. So you can see that the tradition continues. I tried to find an older image of these different rodeo events and then a newer one to kind of compare and contrast, and it's pretty cool seeing them side by side. And of course these newer photos here, that's at the livestock complex. And of course Toka and Oya race, which only the women participated in. Steer riding. So this image here, that's actually a woman on that steer. So obviously the rodeo is more diversified now because there is a women's division, and women just barely started competing in the more extreme rodeo competitions that the men do within the past 20 years. There's also pole bending, and I think pole bending is a relatively new sport that started in around the 70s. Steer wrestling has always been there from the beginning. And these are images of two women doing barrel racing and breakaway, which are traditionally thought of as more masculine sports. And then we have the junior rodeo. So the junior rodeo, like back all the way from the 40s all the way to the 70s. The junior rodeo was mainly teenagers, so it was the younger men. But now the junior rodeo consists of the very little ones, so ages 6, 7 years old. So the meaning of junior rodeo has changed over the years. And obviously, when the babies are involved, their competitions are a lot more cute and fun. Like there's double dummy roping and woolly riding. So during my research, I noticed that the number of rodeos were a little offset. So basically, if the first rodeo was in 1938, then in 2022 we should be celebrating the 85th rodeo. So I did question, like, I wonder why that is. So obviously somewhere along the line there must have been 2 years where the rodeo was canceled. I had consulted with Bernard Siqueiros, who has been an advisor to me during my research. And I brought this detail to his attention, and he mentioned to me that the rodeo and fair was probably canceled during World War II. And that made a lot of sense to me because from what we can see from the 1941 Rodeo and Fair program, that rodeo happened exactly 1 week before Pearl Harbor occurred. So prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. wasn't officially part of the war yet. Um, but on December 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor occurred, and that's when Japan officially announced a declaration of war upon the U.S. and Britain. And the U.S. Congress declared war on Japan the following day on December 8th, thus formally launching the U.S. into World War II. It makes sense to me that 1942 would have been most likely a year to cancel the rodeo celebration because the following year, 1942, um, the troops would have been deployed. So all of the young men and some women would have been shipped off overseas to fight in the war. So I mean I wouldn't I don't think I can imagine that there would be a rodeo and people celebrating while their sons and daughters and husbands are going off to this terrible war. Um, the other year the rodeo was canceled. I discovered I I discovered was in 1984. So I have been through every single runner newspaper from 1954 all the way to 1990. So that's over like 40 years of, I mean, that's about 40 years of newspapers. And I finally found in the 1984 Papago Runner issued on December 14th, there's an article that says that the tribal council disbanded the rodeo committee due to mismanagement. And so that year, 1984, there was no rodeo. This image, dated around 1945, 1946, would have taken place after World War II, because I believe the war ended in 46 or around 45, 46, around that time. So this picture depicts the first rodeo in which a ceremony commemorating autumn veterans occurred. So after World War II, the ceremony of honoring veterans permanently became part of the Papago Rodeo and Fair Grand Entry events. Here we can see the veterans forming a victory V in honor of the 387 Autumn who served in the military. and 18 of which made the ultimate sacrifice. We've only been able to identify one individual in this photo, and that's Ella Narcho standing up front wearing the black vest and skirt. However, we're always looking to identify more people in this photo. So if anyone would like to help in that, you may contact me after the presentation and we can start that conversation. So prior to the creation of the official Miss Papago, Miss Tohono pageant that we know of, there were several O'odham women who were elected to represent the tribe in some kind of pageant form. They were selected mainly from within their community and elected by their community based on their personality and beauty and interest in tribal affairs. So some of the pre-Miss Papago representatives were Florence Lopez, who was from San Javier district, and she represented the nation as Miss Papago in 1940. And there's Alice Noriega of Cells. She also represented Miss Papago and Miss Rodeo in 1948. And I've heard that there's several other um, uh, representatives that also existed besides these two. Another one is Helga Ortiz of Ajo. But this was, again, before the establishment of the official pageant for the nation. And that pageant was founded by Ella Narcho Rumley. In 1962, Fresno Canyon community member Ella and World War II veteran established the Miss Papago pageant while employed at the Tucson Indian Center. She formed and headed the pageant committee and assisted with chaperoning and sponsorship services for the contestants. She helped write the pageant policies that are still followed today. Contestants back then and now must be at least 50% O'odham, have good moral character. This included being chaste. Now, I'm not sure if they still practice this today, but at least prior to the 1980s, the pageant contestants were supposed to be chaperoned the entire time of their pageantry campaign and reign to make sure that they were behaving ladylike. Contestants needed to exhibit knowledge of O'odham language, culture, history. Of course, they needed to be graceful and exhibit beauty and etiquette and good manners. So each contestant had to select a talent, a goal, and a platform as well. And of course, they had to uphold all of these different attributes because they were role models for young O'odham, especially young women. So in 1962, Phyllis Antone was crowned the first Miss Papago. Her father was from Tapawa Village, and her mother was from Lower Santan Valley in the Gila River community. The Tucson Indian Center Board of Directors encouraged her and other O'odham women to compete in the competition. In a 2016 interview, and this interview is located at the Himdag Ki archives, Ms. Antone stated that her talent was public speaking, a skill she learned as a member of the 4-H club. Her goal was to uphold the pageant objectives, to honor where she came from, and to learn more about tribal perspectives on history and current affairs. Her platform was education and encouraging Native youth to pursue higher education. During her reign, she was a student at the U of A. The Tucson Indian Center provided most of the funding for her pageant activities, such as travel and lodging. Her sponsors were members of the Tucson Indian Center Committee, including Mr. and Mrs. Wayne Archer, Ellis Paul, who was a UA professor, Ella Rumley, and Hazel Harold. So these are a few images of other Miss Papago winners. Of course, this was before the pageant was called Miss Tohono, before the tribe changed their name. In the 1960s, I noticed that most pageant winners wore this traditional American tiara with the bling. It's kind of like a princess crown, except for Mary Grace Lucas, who had a one made out of leather. But if you can see on Phyllis, there's the bling tiara. Nina had a bling tiara. Gwendolyn and Muriel Segundo as well. And it wasn't until 1969 and 1970 that we see Carol Garcia sporting the more traditional looking woven basket crown. And so ever since Carol Garcia, every Miss Papago, Miss Tohono winner has worn one of these basket style woven crowns. And here we can see an image of Anita Antone at center from San Javier, and she's with pageant winners who are wearing the basket crowns that she made for them. So Anita Antone has made all of these crowns. So from 1962 to 1968, Miss Papago was also Miss Rodeo. So they were the same individual, and they represented both roles at the rodeo and fair. It wasn't until 1969 that the first rodeo queen, Evelyn Garcia, was appointed, and thus this created the separation of the Miss Papago pageant from the Miss Rodeo competition. Another thing that obviously this distinguished the two from another is that Miss Rodeo was expected to compete in rodeo sports. Not anything too extreme, but Miss Rodeo mainly competed in sports having to do with horsemanship. She needed to exhibit that she took care of her horse. It was well groomed, it was well cleaned, and that she was able to control her horse basically in a variety of different tests. But again, it wasn't until the late 90s, early 2000s that women actually started participating in the extreme rodeo sports such as steer riding. So that pretty much concludes the presentation. I wanted to end on this quote from the Tohono Nation Legislative Branch in Resolution number 234-88. And it states that whereas the annual rodeo and fair was established as an event for the nation as a whole to have a celebration for its members and to promote good public relations with non-members, and whereas the events include the rodeo, fair, art show, powwow, exhibits, fun run, walk, parade, traditional dances, band jams, as well as other sporting activities. And this goal, I feel, is like still the same. That the rodeo and fair is there to bring people together. And yeah, so I'm gonna go ahead and open up. Oh, right, sorry. I do want to give a shout out and a special thanks to Bernard Siqueiros because he's helped me so much during my research, and he acted as an advisor and an editor to me, and made lots of suggestions for changes and things like that. And these are all of the resources that I used in my research. Um, so again, uh, that's over 400 400 issues of the Papago Indian News and the Runner that I went through and read. So yeah, I I'm glad that that's finally come to a conclusion. But also I want to point out that creating this history is an ever evolving process. There's so much history involved here. It's really hard to narrow things down and decide what you're going to leave in and take out. So I'm always going to be adding to this.